Welcome to Her Life Unscripted podcast, inspiring burnt out, stressed out, and stretched thin women to embrace the unscriptedness of life. Hosted by Anna Osborne.
Hello, ladies, and welcome to Her Life Unscripted episode 30. It is a gorgeous fall day today, and I am really happy to be here with all of you. It has been kind of awesome moving into the fall season. It's actually my favorite season. I love to be able to just kind of slow down a little bit, enjoy a pumpkin spice latte, and I mean, come on, everything is pumpkin this time of year. I don't think there's anywhere I go that does not have pumpkin flavored something. So it's just really awesome. This time of year, I think what I love about it is that it isn't necessarily holiday based. You know, I feel like winter is definitely holiday based and things like that, but fall just feels like this slowing down of time. The days get shorter. Football is on. I'm a huge sports fan, and I love being able to, on Sundays have the slider open with the cool air coming in and watching football for as long as my children will let me and all those sorts of things. So it's really awesome to be able to kind of be in my favorite season and connecting with all of you guys. And I'm excited about today's topic. It's one that I just find fascinating, and it's one that I feel like just comes up over and over. And it's kind of one that we've touched on before in terms of stories. And we've talked a lot about kind of, are we our stories, and what does it mean to have a story, and all those sorts of things. But one question I get asked very often from people is this question of, are we our stories, right? That when bad things happen to us, like, how does that define us? And so I want to kind of answer that question because some of you have reached out and asked it, and it's been really amazing dialogue kind of sharing with you guys about that. But I want to do it on kind of a bigger scale today in the podcast to be able to really kind of answer that for folks and also get your guys' kind of feedback on it, because I think that our stories are powerful. And I know that we've established that within the podcast, but I think also sometimes our stories can be really scary. Elizabeth Gilbert, the writer of Eat, Pray, Love, she does a lot of just inspirational work. And she shared earlier this summer, I believe it was, that she had split up from her longtime partner. And it was very sad to see, obviously, that they were separating and parting ways and really trying to do so in a very loving and respectful way. And what she said in kind of her social media post, because she lives quite a public life as a very, motivating, inspiring figure. And she said something to the effect of, and I'll paraphrase here, but she said something to the effect of that this isn't a story yet. This is actually what we're living right now. And so please, for those of you around us, just please be very respectful that this is still something that we're healing from. And it hasn't yet, the chapter hasn't closed or the book hasn't ended. And so it's still very fresh. And so just being able to be extra kind and cautious with that. And I just thought that was such a powerful way of describing that when we're in the middle of something, it can feel really fresh to be able to talk about it. And we haven't really sorted it out or made sense of it yet. And so I think that really comes into play of what we're talking about today is, are we our stories, right? And when do we move from that place of pain in the moment to be able to shift over to a story of healing or a place of moving forward, right? And so that's really kind of where I'm thinking about it today. And the best analogy that I can think of when people ask me this question, am I always going to be the single parent? Am I always going to be the mother of a stillborn? Like, am I always going to be those stories? Because right now they feel so painful and they're so traumatic and they're so scary. And will that always be the ways that I have to define myself? And I think that it's so, first of all, so courageous for people to be asking those questions. But the way that I look at it is this idea of a car crash, right? That when we go through like if your car gets in a car crash, right? And you get the body work fixed and there's no more, the axles and bent or whatever happened in the car crash, right? That it can look like it's back to normal. Right. But that if you run the Carfax report, I think is what it's called, where you run it and you can see if the car's ever been in an accident, right? You can still see that happened and that it's part of the history, that it's part of the story of this car's history, but that the car may look like it was never, banged up to begin with. And so to me, the reason that, that kind of analogy works for what we're talking about is that, yes, we are always our story, but we can go through a healing process to where it may look like on the outside that we're no longer defined by that crash, defined by that injury, but that it'll always be a part of us, right? That story, that wound will always be something that is a raw spot, is something that causes us to pause on certain days when it clubs us over the head and the pain is so deep. And then other days we'll move through and it'll be a surprise to us at the end of the day that we haven't been, our breath hasn't been taken away by the intensity of our story. And so that's really how I look at it in terms of how I answer that question. That yes, we are always our stories, right? It'll always be a part of us. But that as we move through life and we move through the healing process, that we actually get to start having some choice. And the choice being we get to start really deciding how we are defined by our stories, right? And that we move from kind of that victim to survivor, right? That we start moving in and integrating the stories into all the other things that make us who we are. And so although we will always have those tragedies, we will always have those injuries, that they get integrated in a way that creates a sense of wholeness, right? I think about that when tragedies happen or we have dark moments in our life, that they feel so fragmented or isolated from all that we experienced before, right? It starts being like, oh my gosh, how is this experience even happening right now? And how do I make sense of it? Because it feels so fragmented or so distant from what I knew to be true before. And so that's really how I think about this kind of wholeness that happens as we go through the healing process. Our stories are always a part of us, but they get integrated into the wholeness of who we are, right? And so, for example, the label or the story of being a single parent, that yes, that'll always be part of your story and part of your reality, but it also becomes part of the wholeness of, how you move forward in life, and that you are also so many other vibrant things, including a loving, amazing single parent, that allows you to operate from a much more place of wholeness rather than being fragmented. And I think the other piece of that too, as I kind of, think about this out loud, is that when we are fragmented from pieces of ourselves, we tend to show up with a lot of inconsistency, right? I know that it was in the teens. I think it was episode maybe 21. Yeah, I think it was episode 21. So not in the teens, but episode 21, where we talked with Sharani about that kind of inner child work. And it makes me think about these fragmented parts of ourselves, that it really causes us to show up with a lot of inconsistency. And what I mean by that is that when we still have these fractured part of ourselves or these parts of ourselves that haven't been integrated into who we are, that our story is kind of all that we are defined by rather than our journey, right? The headline is only being read rather than the whole book. That when that happens, we can show up very disconnected from ourselves, from others. We can show up very empty at times, very alone, very, very angry, very resentful, right? Those things can happen. And then other moments when we aren't in the depths of that pain, we can show up in a much more light and connected sort of way. And so that then kind of represents that inconsistency, right? And so part of realizing that we are always our stories, and those stories are part of our journey, that as we integrate them in, we actually have a greater ability to show up consistently. And for me, what that means is that when I am struggling with aspects of my story that have been, triggered, or wounded places have kind of gotten a little fresh again, is that if I'm feeling those darker emotions, or I'm feeling these things that cause me to distance myself or kind of fragment off from my support network, that I then have the ability, as I've integrated that story into kind of a wholeness sort of way, that I get to then show up and share that with my people, right? Like the people that my inner circle, my people that I get to be vulnerable with, and those sorts of things that I get to share with them. I'm struggling today, right? Like I want to hide away because it feels like the safest thing to do. And yet I'm reaching out to talk to you about it, right? And so even though I'm feeling those more secluded and fragmented emotions, I'm still using them or sharing them in a way that creates support for me and also prevents me from really isolating away. So that's another piece of kind of thinking about our stories, is that when we define them in a very headline sort of way rather than a novel or book sort of way, we lose out on all these other aspects of ourselves that make us uniquely us, right? Like it is so necessary for us to be whole in order to thrive. And so being able to recognize that we're always our stories, and yet that isn't always the headline that's blaring, is actually, to me, kind of a relief, I think for those of you that have reached out and I've gotten to know a little bit, you guys have been so brave to share your stories with me. And I love, as you're sharing them, also this ability to have a little separation from the story and also realize that although it's always a part of you, it isn't the first way that you define yourself in every single moment. Now, it can definitely be the way that you define yourselves in lots of moments, and I think that that's an okay thing, but every single moment is not governed by that headline. And to me, that feels like a sense of relief, right? Like you can actually breathe a bit. So that's really kind of how I think about our stories. But, I think that it's such a kind of a hot topic right now when we think about stories. And I would love to hear you guys about, how do you define that? Do you believe that we are always our stories? Or do you feel like once the healing has happened, that we actually move to a place where that's no longer relevant? And not in a dismissive way, but that because it's no longer, at the forefront, that it therefore doesn't have that same level of significance. I'm super interested to hear kind of your guys' thoughts on that. And the other part too is also this kind of car crash analogy, right? That if we wrote a Carfax report on ourselves, that the wounds and the injuries will always be part of our history. But is it fair to have the exterior kind of, buffed out and repainted? I don't know. I've got some interesting thoughts on that. I think that oftentimes that's kind of what I refer to as the walking wounded, right? That we can have these really, really deep wounds, but that because we've been buffed out and the dent's been undinged and all those sorts of things, that we kind of are none the wiser. It actually makes me think of the story. Growing up, we were really close with our next door neighbors, and they had a son that was in between a year older than me and a year younger than my older sister. And so we used to hang out all the time and play together as kids. And his dad, who was actually a principal at a local elementary school, he loved his cars. Like he just absolutely loved his cars. And he would be out there, most weekends washing them and vacuuming them and kind of waxing them and buffing them. And they were always just like beautifully clean cars. And I remember when the son, who, like I said, we were friends with, we were probably like junior high-ish age. And I remember he was sitting on kind of the edge, like the window was rolled down of his dad's truck. And he was sitting on the kind of like the window, if that makes sense, like with his butt facing in towards the cab of the truck. And he had his legs kind of dangling on the outside and his head on the outside. Very awkward position. But of course, we're junior hires, so our bodies bend all sorts of ways. But anyway, so he's sitting there, and for whatever reason, he slipped, and he kind of like his tush like shoved in towards the cab, and he went to go kind of like brace himself, and he ended up kicking with his heels in the door, right? Like the outside of the door on the outside of the truck. And this big dent was there because he kicked his heels in. And he like instantly panicked, like, oh my gosh, I just dented my dad's car, and my dad loves his cars. And I don't know if my mom was out there at the time, or we went and got my mom, or somehow my mother got involved. And for those of you that know my mother, and hi, Mom, I hope you're listening, she is like a Renaissance woman. She's like super up on pop culture, yet can play Trivial Pursuit with all the geographical, historical things. And she's super like MacGyver, crafty person. So she comes out with this idea of taking a plunger, like a bathroom plunger, and pushing it into the door and seeing if it'll pop out the dent. Now, we, of course, are like, oh my gosh, Mom. And I think his parents weren't home. I have no idea. Granted, this is 25 years ago. But I remember she did it, and we're all kind of like, biting our nails as she did this. And it ended up working where the dent popped out, right? Like this plunger technique apparently works. So for those of you, I'm not saying it's going to work all the time, but in this one instance, it worked, right? And so here then we are left with this kind of moral dilemma, right? Michael had dented the car. The dent was now removed. And what do we do with him telling Dad? And here my mom's involved. So we're kind of like feeling the pressure of, all right, Mike, you probably need to tell your dad what happened because this is kind of, you can't lie about it, but even though there's no proof that it happened. And so he ended up telling his dad, and I think there was a little bit of pressure from my mom to tell the truth and those sorts of things. But it makes me think of, sorry, that was such a random story, but it makes me think of this idea of that when the dent is no longer there, is it still relevant, right? And my answer is like, hell yeah, it's still relevant. That even though that dent was no longer there and the car was, just perfectly fine, the wound had still happened. And I think that happens sometimes when we have healed in our stories, that when we look like it's all healed on the outside, but we still have that pain on the inside, we still need people to acknowledge that pain has happened. And so being able to put a voice to that, of being able to reach out to people when we're struggling, even if it looks like we should have already kind of moved past it because it no longer looks injured on the outside, that we still have a right to be able to share that story and to have a voice to it. And part of our healing is knowing that that it's always on the table, right? That our wounds are always open for discussion if we so choose, because being empowered to be able to do that is a really, really powerful part of the healing process. And so this idea that once the car is shiny again, is it fair that there is a Carfax report that it will report previous accidents? Yeah, I think so. I think that we really have to be able to move to a place of integration, a place of wholeness where we can be comfortable with owning these parts of ourselves that are very, very wounded despite them having healed. And so for me, that just feels really, really important. But I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on that. Like, are there people that differ, that go, you know what, once you've gone through the healing and all those injuries have been shored up, we don't need to carry them anymore, or maybe we don't need to carry them in the same way. And so I really actually am interested in your guys' feedback on that. So please use the SpeakPipe app. It's in the show notes. And I love your guys' feedback that you've offered. So please just hop on, send a little message, let me know your thoughts, because I think that it's part of kind of this bigger idea of are we our stories and how do we integrate that in? So anyways, I think that's all for today. That was kind of a fun little, kind of mini episode, but I like being able to really continue this dialogue about our stories, and that it's sometimes the chapter is not closed yet and they're too fresh to talk about. And sometimes a lot of time and healing has passed, but we still need to be able to feel like we have the power and the right to share those stories and to connect with other people around them. So anyways, just super excited to be able to connect with all of you guys today. And please go over to the website right now, herlifeunscripted.com, and fill out the little box on the retreat page, because we've got some amazing live events coming up in 2017. And I really want to be able to share the details with you guys on them, because there's just so much planning that I've been doing. And I'm so excited to be able to offer them and really connect with you guys in person, because it is one of my greatest joys to be able to put faces and names to these voices of the SpeakPipe apps, feedback that's coming in, and also your guys' email. So thank you so much for what you guys are doing in terms of just supporting one another and being just an amazing inspiration to me. And I just thank you so much for letting me into your world, into your hearts. And I cannot wait to talk to all of you soon. Take care, you guys. Bye-bye.
Want to learn about the latest retreats, workshops, and speaking events hosted by Anna? Head over to herlifeunscripted.com to get in on all the juicy details. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast so we can continue to grow our amazing audience. Lastly, be sure and send in your voice feedback via the SpeakPipe app or to Anna@herlifeunscripted.com. We can't wait to hear from you.